Okay, I'm gonna leave this window open for like another minute so I feel safer. Now I'm closing it. Oh, that was fun. We have fun here. And we have fun because it's my actual favorite thing to do. I am so excited to be back. This series is, I say it every month because I get to say it every month because it's such a delight. It's my favorite thing to do. It's such a privilege. It's such a joy. It's such just like great space. And I'm so excited that it exists. And I'm so thrilled to all of you for sharing it with us. And so let's not waste any more time. First, we need to talk about who makes all of this possible. And at some level, that's you, right? It's you. And it's you by way of us. And so maybe it's helpful to sort of introduce ourselves and talk a bit about ourselves. And for that, I would love to bring on the sort of executive director of CLAGS, Matt Brim.
Hi, James. Thank you. Hi, everybody. I want to start by thanking our ASL interpreters. Thank you, Ren-yo, for being here with us today. And also just thanks to all the CLAGS folks that are here. James Harris, Laura Westengard are our board co-chairs, hardest working people in queer studies. Donna Human is the administrative associate at CLAGS, hardest working administrative associate at the Graduate Center. And Rod Hurley is our event tech fellow. And Rod, thanks so much for joining us in the fellowship this semester. Thank you for everybody for being here. I'm Matt Brim, and as James said, I'm the executive director of CLAGS. And I have the best job, James, because I just get to brag about the work that you all do. And I want to tell everybody a little bit about this incredible series that James has put together, and that is the Queer of Color, Trans of Color series. Ren-yo Hwang is here today, but we've had Marshall Green and Amber Musser and Luke Hornum and Tavia Nyong'o, Joe Ponce. Next month, we'll have Jose de la Garza. This is just an incredible lineup brought together to talk about the latest innovations and thinking and exciting ideas in queer of color and trans of color studies. So James, thanks for making this series happen. Um, Here at CLAGS, as James said, we do a lot on a little, and everything we do is because of you. Our very short thumbnail mission is CLAGS is here to provide free and accessible LGBT studies to everyone because everyone deserves it. And to help us in that mission of providing free and accessible LGBT studies to everyone, I want to invite you to go to our giving page, and that is Network for Good. I'm going to put it in the chat. If you go to this page, you can see how you can easily donate $10, $25, $50. Every time we do this, we sort of pick out a different target audience to be givers today. So it's beautiful outside. So if you are in a place, listening from a place where it's beautiful outside today, if you could be our donors for this installation of the Queer of Color, Trans of Color series, that would be great. If you're in a place where the weather is beautiful, by your own yardstick of beautiful, please give us $20, $25, $50 if you can. I appreciate it. Before I go, I want to tell you about an event that's going to be happening next week on the 21st. And I've just put that flyer in the chat. And this is the other series that CLAGS is hosting this year. It's the Queer Class Relations series. And so we're going to be welcoming Paisley Kara, who is a professor of political science at Brooklyn College, and Ramsey Fawaz, who is an English professor at the University of Wisconsin. And we're going to be talking about their two recent works, which really focus on form and forms. Ramsey's in a book, Queer Forms, and Paisley's in a book, Sex Is as Sex Does, which focuses a lot on the forms by which sex is regulated in the US. Please join us on the 21st of March at 4 p.m. I think I don't know what the day of the week that is, but it's the 21st at 4. And you can register. I think the registration link is probably in the chat at this point. Everybody, thanks so much for being here. James, thank you for your incredible hard work. And Ren-yo, welcome to CLAGS.
I love it. I love it so much. Thank you, really. Let's just do the bios so that we can get to the talks because that's why you're really here. Ren-yo went. Ren-yo Hwang. interdisciplinary teaching and research, include courses and scholarship in queer and transgender of color critique, feminist of color anti-violence initiatives, and genealogy, abolition, transformative justice, and community accountability. Hwang's current scholarship examines carceral technologies of control and punishment, anti-violence reform-based state partnerships of the late 20th century, and discourses concerning the identification of violence. Hwang's first manuscript offers a critical interdisciplinary study of anti-violence strategies, namely hate crime policies, data, and community policing, against queer and transgender of color survivor-based practices at the margin of mainstream politics in Los Angeles, California over 3 critical decades, the 1980s to 2010s. They've published scholarship in Transgender Studies Quarterly and Critical Ethnic Studies Journal. Hwang's a program co-chair for the 5-college certificate in queer, trans, and sexuality studies, serves on the editorial board for Women's Studies Quarterly, 2020 American Studies Association Program Committee, and selected CISA Fellow from 2018 to 2019. That's so much bio, and it always feels so intimidating to people to hear their life read back to them. And I'm so much more interested in where you are going forward. So, I'm thrilled to share the floor. Take it and share. What?
Thank you so much, and thanks for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. My connection to CUNY goes back to the times I want to start by saying I already did the thank yous earlier when we weren't recorded or live streaming, so it's worth saying again and again. I want to thank you, James, for reaching out and just the vision around this monthly series. And thank you to all the folks behind the scenes, in particular, the co-directors at CLAG and Donna, Laura, Matt, and the ASL interpreters today, Miriam and Andrea, if I'm saying that correctly, and also our tech person on Rod. So anyways, it always takes a huge team, and I just want to say thank you for making this happen. And then thanks to the folks who are joining on a Thursday evening. Hope you're like enjoying some tea and some food while I talk about abolition. I was going to say that can I do the BTS information, James, a bit? Like, I was like, we're doing a book talk, and James was like, well, are we? Like, this is called a conversation. And I was like, very true. And so I'm gonna like talk through things, but I am also going to talk about the book project because it's how I connect to the series in terms of queer and trans of color methods, critique, studies. So I think I should just jump into my slides if I can here. I am currently in South Hadley, Massachusetts, which is, I'm at Mount Holyoke College, which is the ancestral lands of the Nonotuck, Nipmuc, and Patumtuck people. And so let me begin by doing a screen share. That's great. I have more slides than I'll be able to get to, which is like my style. Oh, okay. So the conversation today is going to be around the book project, but I am going to be thinking a lot about methods and the study itself. The book project currently is titled Trans of Color Entrapments, Carceral Coalitions, and Identitarian Violence in Los Angeles. Okay. So queer trans of color critique. I'm pulling here, this is a quote from Rod Ferguson, and he is stating here, and I'll just read it. In the 21st century, we are witnessing the use of homosexuality, transgender identity to promote the state's capacities to legitimate state violence abroad. This can only be done within an ideological horizon in which homosexuality, transgender identity have been severed from the state and imperialism. More pointedly, the creation and ascendancy of a one-dimensional ideology about queer sexuality has helped to usher in this moment in which queerness and trans identity are compatible with state violence. And so I think this really grounds a lot of my entry point into thinking with queer and trans of color critique. So the two fields, transgender and queer studies, I'm thinking about kind of identity politic formations and the concepts of identity politics as originating from Black feminist collective statement, the Combahee River collective statement. I know many of us began with this in like a gender studies 101 class. But Barbara Smith, who's actually an alum of Mount Holyoke College, came to talk last night in person for our inaugural in our department, Critical Race Political Economy, that just became a department. And she was just giving this, the theme of the paper was actually the road to Combahee. So I'm just feeling very in the kind of like, in the spirit and like generosity of the work that the Combahee River Collective folks did as Black, queer, lesbian women who were thinking about, you know, prior to the kind of coinage of Crenshaw's intersectionality, right? But thinking about identity politics in terms of its radical potential. And I'm pulling here, obviously, from Cohen's, also the radical potential of queer politics. So in that sense, I'm also thinking with carceral studies, right, which has emerged to kind of name and talk about the problems with kind of the carceral universe, if you will. And specifically, I'm looking at reformist reforms and abolitionist reforms, or abolition altogether. These are some two quotes to kind of help us ground what I mean when I'm talking about these things. And so reformist reforms generally as maintaining the status quo, not threatening the existing carceral structure and infrastructure. And then abolitionist reforms, or sometimes called non-reformist reforms, as advancing a radical critique, radical imagination, where reform is not the end goal, transformation is. That's the omni. Am I going too fast, James? This is a good pace. Great. This is, you know, often used, really great, so much material that you can find still on criticalresistance.org. And this is, you can find this on other kind of abolitionist education, kind of community educative sites like Transform Harm that Miriam Taba has. But this is kind of a chart to think about in the kind of material reality of like, what does reformist reform and abolition look like? And this one's specific to policing. Anyways, just giving. I'm going to, for time's sake, I'm going to skip this one, but I will go on to talk about the use of anti-violence and its co-optation, right? That gets used through kind of reformist reforms. And how specifically this is important when we're thinking with kind of the emergence of the institutionalization of identity politics. And so this is a quote. And many people have written about this. I'm thinking specifically of Emily Thuma's latest book, To All Our Trials, but specifically about in the kind of call to talking about abolition feminism as a possibility against carceral feminism. So, okay. So the kind of fields, and I think this is kind of the conversation, right, is like, how am I thinking with trans, queer of color studies? I'm thinking about them, as I just mentioned, through trans studies, carceral studies, critical race ethnic studies, which is what I did my PhD in. I did a master's in Asian American studies. And I'm also thinking with cultural and visual studies, all these interdisciplinary spaces, feminist action research, experimental ethnography, like kind of self-taught in some ways, right? Social movement history. I'm gonna look at some archival stuff. I'm not a historian. And critical data legal studies. Many people in my life practice law reluctantly or with a lot of I think, ambivalence. And I work in a lot of community coalitional spaces with lawyers. And so I think about the law in this kind of more capacious way than just kind of, I would say, like close to text kind of legal reading. Okay, moving on for now. I think the research interest is repetitive. Oh, So the book project, which in my the latest emergence is that it's under contract with Duke, so as fast as I can revise it. And yeah, so that's the exciting part, is that it hopefully will be out soon, and this will be kind of a precursor to it. So I start with like, why this book project? How did I get involved? And so when I think about like queer and trans studies, it's interesting because I came into it from doing QT BIPOC activism on the ground, anti-violence activism on the ground. So I spent 8 years or so in New York. Really, I feel like building I like to think of it as like where I really got educated on thinking about identity politics from a radical perspective, through volunteering with organizations like Audre Lorde Project and Sylvia Rivera Law Project and Queers for Economic Justice when it was still around. And I was definitely in the mix with Fierce. And so these are like kind of the places in which I feel like I really emerged to understand what politics meant to me. And so the studies part, I feel like came after when I decided to go back into a space of thinking and focusing on the potential of like an intellectual and like activist based project that is so hard to kind of find time to do without the luxury and also like the burden of kind of a graduate school. So that's what brought me to Los Angeles, was doing my Asian American studies at UCLA. And so in that time and a little bit after, when I started the PhD program at UC Riverside, I went there to go study with abolitionist scholar activists such as Dylan Rodriguez. And I really spent most of my like time in the field, which I like really, these are kind of the terms I resent and also push back against, but I really, was not writing my dissertation, and I was like just out doing work with community organizations I really cared about and got involved with, such as Gender Justice Los Angeles, Dignity Power Now, which was formerly the Coalition to End Sheriff Violence in LA Jails, which I was one of the originary folks. And now I'm back on the board, which is really exciting. But I was doing a lot of mutual aid work with trans and queer folks that were coming through both the gay and trans jailing unit in Los Angeles, Men's Central Jail. And I'll talk a bit more of how that kind of created a basis for some of the work. So the project really started to emerge when I participated in these actions. This one, the Trans Lives Matter National Day of Action in 2014, you can see in the center here in this photo I took. I was part of like, there was a big group of us that were part of a safety team. They shut down the intersection here. It was one of the busiest intersections at the end of the workday. You see Bambi Salcida kind of at the right side of the hand raising the poster, who is the founder of Trans Latina Coalition, Maria Roman, plenty of other folks that I won't go into naming. And so we kind of encircled a group of folks who were doing a die-in in the center of the intersection here. This was on Vermont and Beverly. And this is a video I actually was able to record of Bambi, doing the code switching and intervening with the LAPD officer who was like, I'm here to support you all and make sure that your rights are being protected. And you can see the person actually in the video across from Bambi kind of like really reading the situation and being like, do you think I should play it? I'm not sure how it'll pick up on the webinar, James.
Yeah, no, go for it. Absolutely. Give it a shot.
It's a pretty short video. Let me see if you can hear.
Everything in your personal rights are legally protected in that one. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Nice to meet you. You're welcome. Yeah. Everything in your
Okay. but he's describing, I'm making sure your First Amendment rights are being protected. We're gonna like break this down in a moment. I'm gonna move on for time's sake, but this is also another part of the rally in which they're at the Vermont Santa Monica. I think I said Beverly in misspoke. This is the metro station. It's next to. All right, sorry. So these rallies didn't emerge out of nowhere, right? There were three heartbreaking and kind of ripple effect, echo effect deaths in the trans QT BIPOC community from spring of 2014 until December. So within 6 months, there were 3 trans women of color who were killed. Zoraida Ale Reyes, who was well known as being kind of a leader in the undocuqueer migrant justice movement. And so this is one of the profiles of the folks that is central to and animating how I think about queer trans of color activism as informing the space of the work that I'm doing. Anaya Asia Parker, I was able to go to the vigil at the time. Many community folks were there. And there was a couple of memorials at the sites in which she was shot down. I'm going to refuse to like go into detail about their deaths. That happens plenty enough through the news, but I want to kind of hold the space to kind of call in their names into the project, because it is how I think a lot of the actions I got involved in emerged. And then Deshonda Tata Sanchez, which was a youth that one of a friend of mine actually worked with at the drop-in center, Renee Bever, and knew Deshonda and her kind of goals to go to fashion school. I think she was making, you know, attire on her own, but she was only 21. And this happened in South LA in December of 2014. So during this time, what kind of was revealed is this high tension in LA QT BIPOC community around the enforcement of anti-trans hate crimes. There was a lot of calls to wanting the assistance from LAPD to criminalize anti-trans hate crimes, specifically, not just as gender as a classification of hate crimes, but transgender specifically. And Michaela Mendelson, who's kind of a well-known businesswoman, trans businesswoman in LA, part of Trans Can Work, she stated, actually, this is a quote from the action, that they, LAPD, won't classify anything as crimes, as hate crimes. The last murder of Anaya Parker, she was murdered by 3 men, ambushed her, pushed her, and you can read the rest. So in 2015, there was another action that many of us were also part of the safety team for, that, you know, was covered in major LA Times and other places, but a similar action of shutting down. This was at the Beverly Center, which is further west. But this was a coalition between Familia, Trans Latino Coalition, GGLA, and other folks. But it was kind of a slow emergence of trying to escalate actions. But even at this time, you see the breaks within community between calling for hate crimes and thinking beyond hate crimes. And then also all of the in-between, where people use kind of the colloquial like hate crimes as meaning anything around targeted bias violence, right? And not necessarily meaning I'd like to see the police prosecute and do such and such. And also sometimes a little bit of both. So I mentioned this because here we are in this moment in which rainbow carceralism, you know, and we have kind of an abolitionist or queer trans abolitionist pushback, such as Cops Out of Pride, right? And so I think it's helpful to kind of go back to how we are in a point where a cop is coming to a trans, you know, a trans the rally from 2014, and approaching Bambi Salcida saying he's here to protect them. When in 1975, this is when LAPD was being invited, the chief of police at that time, E.M. Davis, and he, you know, this, I just typed it out on the right for accessibility, but he's declining the invitation, right? And he said, "I'd much rather," this is the end of the note, "celebrate Gay Conversion Week, which I will gladly sponsor with the medical practitioners in this country, find a way to convert gays to heterosexuals," right? So we're in this moment, and somehow then we're also the arc of carceral pride within the last, I would say, the momentum in the last few decades, right? But even 75 to 80, which is the period I'm starting to focus on, there's these large shifts that happen, which hopefully I'll have time to get to. So the backlash around carceral pride, right? This idea that, you know, we stick rainbow decals on the police vehicles, we have LGBT representation within policing, in sheriffs, within prisons, within the military, and so forth. And so I'm trying to trace a little bit of how LA kind of sits in a very specific and important geography to track, and I'll explain more of that. So at the same time, there's carceral pride, and there's also prideful arrest, right? You have this moment in which this kind of clashing that happens, mostly when there was a call to have the goal, the Gay Association for Officer League, to be not included in the most recent prides. This is a banner you can see here that's held across the street. This is in New York. There are no queer-friendly cops. This is from 2017 on Fifth Avenue. And so now I'm quoting Morgan Vasquez, Alexander Lee, and Dean Spade. "In an age when thousands of people are locked up to protect public safety, LGBT organizations march hand in hand with cops and pride parades. Being impossible may just be the best thing we've got going for ourselves. Impossibility may very well be our only possibility." Okay, so my project then, because of kind of the stakes of the things that are happening very in real time, I wanted to understand this genealogy specific to Los Angeles in terms of the ways in which hate crimes have been institutionalized, both through the county, through LA County, LA City, the Human Relations Commission. There's a long history there. So I do a lot of archival research to look at community-based and minoritarian archives. I think about law as a cultural production and object, so reading data reports, legislation, policy through a process of defamiliarization. So what is it, not just what's on the page, right? But what is it actually gesturing to? And how can we denaturalize the ways in which law kind of gets assumed as objectively so? Queer of color, queer trans of color critique shows up in many ways, specifically through kind of the visual media culturals of carcerality that I look at, from everything from documentaries, news media, music videos, a lot of newsletters. I didn't put that there, flyers, because if we're thinking 1980s and 90s, right, a lot of things are happening in print material. And I really wanted to center kind of community-based action research. And so I did a series of roundtables that, interestingly enough, I feel like might not show up as like it isn't a chapter in the book, but is kind of used throughout to kind of deepen some of the stakes. And then experimental ethnography, as I mentioned, as a way of like a resistance to kind of the idea of like authoritarian authorship of like, I have the things to say about. So my big questions were like, how has mainstream pro-trans identity politics become influenced by pro-carceral politics, right? Another question that's longer is how have coalitional strategies centering justice-based remediation How have they oftentimes unintentionally, right, prioritized the outcome of law, order, punishment as accountability? And how does this diminish the possibility for more investments in holistic, preventative, anti-punitive, and community-based solutions to address the root causes of minoritarian or targeted bias-motivated violence was kind of the terminology before hate crimes emerged as a criminological term in the early 80s. So the big takeaways, and I think I'm not spoiling anything, but like the 1980s in Los Angeles charted a new era, which minoritarian social movements and civil rights organizing under the banner of anti-violence, as I mentioned in the opening slide, became dutifully tracked into vision of winnable goals by way of law and order, the endless multiplication of anti-Black criminalization and punishment that followed. So I use this concept of carceral coalitions, right? I'm thinking of all the ways in which coalition is often kind of assumed, right, as always doing radical work, right? But what does it mean when we actually look at coalitional building that's been done from the left even, right, and liberal spaces, but in some ways reproducing kind of law and order. And so you'll see some of the citations and places and people I'm thinking of in a moment. I do this to spotlight how coalitional building might perform across identity, multi-issue, multicultural politics, but also reinforcing ongoing carceral agendas and carceral futures, right? And the book demonstrates how state-based gender-responsive entrapments have only further carved out penal pathways as models for securing trans safety, and how abolitionist feminist interventions might be possible in re-envisioning safety altogether. How am I doing on time? You'll tell me.
I will, you're good.
Okay. So why this period, right, if it's not already made clear, but in the last 4 decades, particularly the 80s and 90s, I'm interested in. Obviously, this is off the heels of like massive kind of what we would call like third world liberatory kind of insurgency, rebellion, and movements, right, of the 60s and 70s. And there's a moment in which this pendulum that I'm interested in which identity and multiculturalism, or some people, you know, this can also be talked about in terms of neoliberalism, right? But this emergence in which 1980s and 90s is also the moment in which hate crimes is emerging. And so the book focuses on social political relations and identity politics, the once radical Black feminist intervention, and still, but in the sense of how it's been taken up and co-opted, right? We conceive of, I'm skipping around, sorry. Once radical Black feminist intervention to how we conceive of identity embodiment as an impetus for liberatory social change, how that has instead been largely controlled by this period's institutionalization of minority difference. Dialectically managed by colonial white supremacist historical forces that have sought to allay any social unrest that has challenged state power, such neoliberal pacification of radical potential of difference has, time and time again, been only metabolized to ensure the diversification of statecraft and state power. I'm like reading that, I'm like, I should rewrite that for the book. Okay. And so the 1980s is framed through this kind of how does social minoritarian identity become used to kind of share an investment in criminological technologies of classification and identification and carceral identification through things such as hate crimes. Tools such as inclusive crime data, stats, community participatory crime reporting, community-based policing, right? Create alliances with local law enforcement to be against violence that targets one community, but it's only for the possibility of police-community collaboration, right? So the chapters look at, and this very much is starting to feel like a book talk, sorry, James, but the like pieces are, you know, I think it's helpful because, right, I appreciate the space of thinking out loud and this revision part of the book, right? It helps me to get grounded in that way. And I love hearing feedback and questions. It really is like what animates what I do next. But the first part, I really think about the genealogy of hate crimes, right? So I talk about this through this idea of model minoritarian conscription. The second chapter, I think about, because obviously in the 80s and 90s, there's not the call for anti-trans hate crimes to be legislated, or so instead there's this emergence in the 80s and 90s, specifically around anti-gay and I say this like not intersectionally, and anti-Asian violence, right? And it gets termed in both of these spaces as new civil rights. And there's a bit of that chapter that then looks at gay and Asian organizing in LA at that time as well. And then the third chapter, as I mentioned, K6G, the gay and trans jailing unit that I was doing mutual aid work in, and still am in relationship to other places people have been sentenced, the kind of trans, the different trans yards, sensitive needs yards that they're placed in when they're having to serve their sentences, if they are in the California public prison system, but in CDCR. But all to say that this chapter looks at kind of the emergence of gay trans jailing unit, K6G, formerly K11, that also emerged in the 1980s at the same period in 1982, right? And so it's really this kind of formative time. And then lastly, I think about kind of more largely through the more experimental ethnographic section about trans of color life. And I think about it through this LAPD Walk of Remembrance that, if I have time at the end, I will mention, which is actually a chapter that's in QED that came out last year on transformative justice. But so that's kind of more specifically about LAPD today, and it's kind of rainbow carceralism. So why do I organize it this way? I'm thinking about kind of penal reform across law, jailing, and policing. So hate crimes in terms of prosecutorial power, gay and trans jailing as custodial power, and LGBT-friendly police force in terms of disciplinary power. Okay. There's like so much text. Like, should have edited this down. I did. It's still this long. So carceral coalitions is, as I mentioned before, I'm thinking with scholars such as Naomi Murakawa in terms of like racial liberalism and liberal law and order, but about specifically the ways in which select representatives are strong-armed and from targeted or minoritized communities to form and reform minoritized political identities within spaces and logics of carcerality. And so I'm thinking about the ways in which they're brought into the select representatives are brought into the work of producing, reforming, and improving the methods in which criminalization of violence might be counted, but never truly transformed, deterred, or interrupted. And like a example of that is about inclusivity into the data, right? And so, and like, what does that actually do for communities on the ground that are being harmed, right? The technologization of crime data, such as hate crimes, is akin to the historical development of state records and record keeping as a mode of expanding its own juridical, disciplinary, penalizing power. It's obviously very Foucauldian bits in here. Okay. So I think about kind of conscription, and I'll get to that in a moment, but I'm going to skip through this for now. But conscription of minoritarian difference is how I'm thinking about, quite literally, conscription is like conscription into the military, but I'm thinking about it in terms of also then community partners to the state, right? And so conscription as kind of the ways in which even in the practice of, and I'm quoting myself, I'm reading my own slide here, practice of ensuring otherwise historically dismissed, neglected, marginalized, and even state-endorsed targeted minority-based violence. There's process by which community, in quotations, right, who gets counted as community, is required for this identification of violence, right, to be implemented and carried out through a model of representational identity politics or identificatory inclusion into carcerality. And so carceral accuracy is a method I talk about within the text or the book about carceral coalitional building. And I'm going to be done with a bunch of There'll be more like looking at slides in a moment, but carceral accuracy is the way I'm trying to describe this process in which there's been this preoccupation with reforming violent crime data, to have community, like minoritized community organizations participate in that. And then this narrative vehicle relies on the ideological state apparatuses founded in penal logics that have already equated anti-violence as that which needs to reform and amend criminological matrices. So in what's the best way to measure violence, right? So a lot of this has to do with like retraining police because people are underreporting, because they're concerned about talking to the police because of historical bias. So let's deputize certain minority organizations to be places that they can report. And this all seems like the right direction in which you want people to be able to find resources to figure out what they can do to address the harm and violence that they faced or people, their loved ones. But in the end, if what it does is only improve the measures for policing, these are the ... questions in the book. So I'm going to skip this part. So I'm thinking about then this moment, and I'll spend a little time not on all the chapters, but so before anti-trans hate crimes, thinking about anti-gay and anti-Asian violence and its emergence. So I look at, and I did through kind of looking and spending a lot of time specifically at the One Archives in Southern California, and big ups to the awesome archivists there that have been just like near and dear and so helpful. But I looked really closely at the ACLU gay rights chapter, which later becomes the ACLU LGRC. It's the first of its kind in the nation. It's the first, like, it started as like a panel, a gay rights panel, or the homosexuality committee in the early 70s, and then evolved to the LGRC. But the reason I started there is because actually they were part of the case to making the gay and trans jailing unit possible, because that's what I started thinking about first somehow. And so I was looking at some of their files, and it confirmed a lot of my suspicions around their role in kind of working with police specifically. And obviously they are a civil liberties union. So I want to just make the disclaimer, I'm not shitting on ACLU. I have relied on them often for legal support for a lot of things. The organizations I've worked with have worked with ACLU and SoCal. What I am trying to track is how is it that we see almost the kind of easefulness in which convening with police and law reform as central, right? Even and who is it actually in kind of favor of? And you see this group here, right? Kind of in terms of like who is actually in the room thinking about kind of gay and lesbian at this time, right? Rights, and who's actually being framed. And so here, this is on the left, this is from 1991. This is kind of the emergence of the Gay and Lesbian Police Advisory Task Force that ACLU is a part of. And you see here later, I mentioned the Gay and Lesbian Center, and the ways in which kind of particularly in the police reforming that's happening following the Rodney King and LA uprisings of 92, right? There's a lot of connections that are being made to kind of shore up kind of policing reform through different modes of community-based policing forums. Here a couple more from my archival. This one's from 79, actually, on the left, right? So we see kind of actually in the late 70s, the kind of focus on police abuse to a great extent across these issues of immigration, custody, and so forth. This is a day that was happening for some time, since I think up into the 90s, called Gay Law Day. And then on the right, this is from 1989. So a decade later, you see kind of like on the front pages of their newsletter, the exciting kind of like guest speaker of one of the first out gay sergeants within LAPD, kind of the celebration. And there's many kind of parade type things that happen throughout history. And then I also look, so the major players I look at for the anti-gay violence is ACLU, SoCal, the LGRC, and the center. And they're very co-involved, right, in terms of expanding kind of services and support for both from the legal and health services, right? And the LA Gay and Lesbian Center is the biggest gay and lesbian center globally, and both in terms of kind of the operating budget to the service provision. And so, and is one of the first established in 1969. But we see here, this is on the second page, I just showed the same cover, but the kind of concerns around gay and lesbian reform of LAPD to think about gay and lesbian communities specifically. And this is in 1991, after I had mentioned the brutal beating of Rodney King. And similarly, things that have emerged since, such as West Hollywood Citizens, this is a coalition, right, for better police protection. And so there's kind of different, there's a whole politics within WeHo itself that I'm not going to get into, but just to give you a sense of the kind of like rainbow carceralism you see in the center, this rainbow badge of Los Angeles County Sheriffs, because it's actually the Sheriff's Department that oversees policing in West Hollywood. They don't have their own, it's not actually through LAPD. So there's a kind of way in which the Sheriff's Department and the police I focus on together.
Can I hop in? I think
Yes,
I want to.
Yeah.
Are you ready? Are you ready for questions? Can we ask questions?
Yes, well, what I'll do, can I have like a minute to just tie up?
Absolutely.
Okay,
Certainly.
yeah. So I look at I am totally getting into the weeds, James, and I'm like, this is
well, and you're raising things that everyone wants to ask questions about. So, you know.
Here's some from the LA Gay and Lesbian Center. It's the same thing. I show the emergence of the Anti-Violence Project and hate crimes as kind of being central. And then I turn to anti-Asian crime kind of from the 80s to the 90s, and how that also gets established through things such as Asian American Advancement of Justice, but I want to, and then I talk about the Asian Pacific Gay and Lesbian, which was an organization established in 1980, which is now a nonprofit still in LA that functions. So what I didn't get to, and I'm going to literally, sorry, I'm going through this. I talk about all of these forums that are about trans kind of policing and policing trans people better, and all of the hypocrisy in it. It's basically like, let's be kinder, gentler, the Rose Braz critical resistance kind of critique of like the kinder, gentler police or prison. And what I didn't get to talk about that I think is helpful is then this emergence of the LAPD trans walk of remembrance. So, and I'll end here, which is this is after all of the big actions that I opened the slides with, that they decided in November that they were going to do a walk of remembrance right on the heels of Trans Day of Remembrance, specifically to show that they were for trans people, and they're inviting trans folks to walk with them. And there basically was this protest and counter protest that kind of split into two sides of the street. And I was kind of oscillating between both. But I write about this in the final chapter about kind of the protests. So I'll end with, it's not this one. You see here also this trifecta I talk about of like the American flag, the trans flag, and the Israeli flag, which I think is like really important to think about pink washing at this time too. And actually someone almost anticipated those flags being there and has this sign that says, "Don't pink wash police brutality." So I think I'm going to end there. But yeah, thanks for letting me kind of go across many, many different types of spaces. I hope that was, I hope that landed.
I I need maybe all of us to just take a deep breath and a thank you, first of all. Because I have 10,000 thoughts. I mean, that was incredible. That was incredible. I want to start with congratulations on the book contract, obviously. Yay, very exciting. Um, normally the way we do this is I ask my first question, but you've anticipated my first question, which is usually some variation on in what way does queer of color show up in your work. But I feel like you've already pretty well covered that. So maybe a corollary to that question can be kind of disciplinary, which is you're housed in a political science department, right? Like how tell me, so I guess I'm thinking disciplinarily, right? How does this work? How does the scholarship show up in your work? How do you think through sort of the way in which disciplinary legibility becomes important for the kinds of things you think are important or interesting to talk about?
I'm in a, I've been having this like terrible cough post-COVID, long COVID. So I apologize. I do need a cough drop. I am in a critical race political economy department, which is kind of like a critical ethnic studies department that it came together to pull different ethnic studies programs to have departmental power. But to your question, I'm also in gender studies. One of my colleagues, Niev Timmons, is on the call. Hey, Niev. Shout out to Niev in gender studies. But I'm in both. And so I guess the question, if I could remix it, is a little bit like, how do I tend to teaching in both spaces? I mean, obviously there's like the registrar cross-listing, but how I think about, and all my classes end up getting cross-listed because there's never a time unless it's like the like intro class, right? That's, the kind of intro to CRPE foundations or the gender studies, but otherwise all my classes are cross-listed. And so I'm very much in two very, very interdisciplinary spaces. And so I'm not sure if I answered your question, but I don't have that disciplinary concern because I did my PhD in critical ethnic studies and all of my concerns have always been interdisciplinary. And so I think so I'm not sure if I understood your question, but that's what I gathered. Yeah.
I don't know if I understood my question either. I guess what I'm trying to unpack for myself, and I'm going to open the floor to other people, is sort of like what I find so exciting and fascinating about this project is the way that it takes the language of queer of color critique and sort of melds it into what it means to think political science and political economy. And it seems like this is a space that feels sort of under theorized, right? That like what I find so interesting about this book is that like you've gone really far into like how does the law work and then also how does the carceral state emerge, right, in a way that feels really generative and exciting. And I guess I'm wondering, I mean, and you've already done the work of talking through sort of like what does that trajectory look like, but I guess I'm maybe thinking also sort of like what do you what about that sort of connection seems generative to you? What are the ways in which thinking law helps to sort of make sense out of queer studies or queer sort of the questions that queer theory often wants to raise, if that makes any sense?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely would never charlatan. I would never call myself a political scientist or doing political science. And I would never say even like political theory wholly, but I do get your question in terms of like how did I get preoccupied with the law? And I think it's because when you're doing abolitionist work on the ground, you see even in the wildest ways in which we prefiguratively are kind of visioning this world for abolition, you see how the law creeps into everything we do, right? Whether it's like trying to get somebody out on bail, trying to figure out how to get someone moved to a different facility, how to basically show up and do court support. It's just like the law is everywhere. And so I think that my preoccupation was from actually material engagement on the ground with folks, that I was just seeing like, how do we think with the space and understand the ways in which we've also naturalized it and normalized it into the language of liberation, right? Like we're saying hate crimes. Most people don't actually mean like, I can't wait for this person to get a 5-year enhancement on top of their other sentencing. Like they're not thinking specifically about that mechanics. And for me, I'm not like, let me correct you in what you mean. I think I was just interested in like, how is it that we've emerged at this point that this becomes the dividing line at the LAPD Walk of Remembrance, right? That like you had a ton of trans women of color who were walking with LAPD, who were very much working at the Gay and Lesbian Center, were different kinds of leaders in community, right? And then you had a whole nother group of QT BIPOC trans women, femme, masked folks of color on the other side. And so that's what I was really interested in, is like, how is it that some of us are proceeding and seeing kind of the vision of working cooperatively with police and the law, right? As you know, so yeah, that's just how the law shows up for me. I try to think about it as kind of a it's kind of cultural circulation rather than seeing myself as like a critical race theorist who's studying law, right? If that makes sense. Thank you.
That makes tons of sense. I think we've got some other questions. I can read them. My co-chair, Laura, can read them. They can be read by their askers. I have no specific preference.
Well, I'll read it. Let's switch this up. So the question is actually from our executive director, Matt Brim, who has put the question in the chat. And I want to encourage everyone who's here to go ahead and put your questions and comments and answers and anything you want to share with our speaker in the chat or in the Q&A forum. We will see it either way. So Matt asks, one of your chapter titles begins with a slightly less hellish. I'm very interested in the idea this part of the title raises of gradation and relative complicity, etc. How do you think about scale or depth or imbrication in that chapter, or more generally when looking at the presence and reach of policing?
Yeah, that's it. I'm gonna think on that even beyond my like my answer now. And I was like literally going to the page of the chapter to be like, what is the full name of that chapter? I am there, you know, it's gonna all be kind of modified. So that chapter is about K6G, the Gay and Trans Jailing Unit, and I say slightly less hellish. I think that's actually a quote from someone. I need to look, but I watched a lot of these kind of like LA Weekly docu series of like K6G is this like really important gay and trans dormitory and safety haven within otherwise men's male designated jail, right? These are people that are awaiting sentencing or awaiting trial. So this is pre-trial detention, right? And so there's been a lot of coverage and celebration. There's also a really terrible movie that I decided I'm not going to write about. I wrote about, I'm not putting in the book, that Kristen Stewart's mom made, who was like, I think a script runner for some time in Hollywood, but I'm not even going to say the name of it to promote it here, but it's kind of like a semi-horror film about K6G. But it's like centering this like trans Latino woman. It's so problematic in all the ways. But just to say, like, it's become a place of like a cultural understanding of what it means to create protective spaces or protective mechanisms within carceral spaces. And so the slightly less hellish is to say that a lot of the folks who I know who've been there and I go to visit when they're in there have talked about it being like absolutely the preference beyond being in general population, right? But in reality, it's there's still the same kinds of as you can imagine, structural violence that then feeds into disciplinary violence by the correctional officers and so forth. So the scale, I'm thinking in terms of like how this kind of ebbs, or like I would say, there's versions of K6G not named as such across the US, both in jails and prisons. And so, but definitely LA County becomes like a central model. It also self-touts itself as being this progressive model of jailing. And I guess that, yeah, I'll leave it there. Yeah, I hope I answered your question, Matt.
Thank you. And Matt, does want to express enthusiasm for that chapter title as well. We have another audience question from Nick, who says, "Thank you so much for your incredible talk. Your work sounds so exciting and important. I can't wait to read your new book." And Nick is speaking for all of us. I want to ask, what are some of your favorite moments when you were doing your ethnographic work? And what are some ways that you engage in self-care as you are thinking and writing about anti-violence and violence?
Thanks, Nick, for that question. That's so thoughtful. What a thoughtful and like special question. Let's think about that together. What are your favorite moments when you're doing ethnography? Well, you know what? I honestly wasn't like, I'm doing ethnography and I'm out on the streets and I have my notebook and I'm taking notes and I'm going to tell people this is my position. I was just out in the streets doing work with people because I was kind of like, am I going to finish this PhD? I don't know. And so for me, it was like, where are the relationships that I care about? Where are the relationships that feed me and nurture me? So this kind of gets to the last part of your question. That's really where I spent my time, is with people that I felt were teaching me the most every single day. Like, I have no business writing about prisons, honestly, because I haven't lived in a prison, right? And I haven't lived in a jail. I've been arrested for things through actions and other things, but that's very different. And so I like to think about the work I do as like this collaborative possibility, with folks who I feel like I'm in deep relationship with. And so sometimes it shows up on the page and sometimes it doesn't. Like, I wrote one of my earlier articles that I think more people have read. It's around deviant care, deviant futures, in TSQ. I very much talk about the mutual aid work I was doing, with folks inside in Corcoran, California. But with this book, I'm finding it kind of gets back to James' question about the law. It's like I end up going down these rabbit holes that I'm like, how does this all connect back? And I'm trying to find my way there. But it's in the sense I'm trying to tell this story of like, how did this arc happen that we're here, right? And it's not that I'm explaining it as like teleologically this one thing, as much as I'm just curious about like, how is it that honestly I was in New York had a very different set of politics based on the geography and relationship to NYPD, right, than in LA. And so that was part of that, you say engage in self-care, honestly being with people that I know, I kind of trust politically. But those often aren't always people in academia. And so it really is like finding kind of people that really understand and want to build that kind of life affirming political liberatory work in and outside of different institutional spaces, including the academy. So I'll just say that much, but great question.
Great answer. Uh, if there are other questions, people should ask them. We'll give ourselves a moment to collect all of our thoughts, because we are going to wrap up soon, I believe. And because it's been so incredible. I mean, I think we're all still processing. Like, I'm definitely gonna be revisiting this and thinking a lot about all the really incredible, like, just the network of it's also very exciting. It leaves me in the place of wanting to ask sort of like a totalizing question or a wrap up question or a change directions question, but I worry that we've covered all of those bases. Um, whenever I have a friend who every time we see each other, we end on, "What are you reading?" So I'm just gonna go with that. Friend, what are you reading?
I'm reading students' midterm papers that are coming in.
So relate
Um,
that's so
so
relatable.
no, let's like have a more clever, what were we just reading in class? I'm like having a hard time. There's so many books that I just haven't read, to be honest. That's like the reality, is like I have beautiful books that I haven't read. Um, and this is like how TMI are we being? I'm literally, my audiobooks are like parenting books because I have a toddler. So it's like, I'm like, whole brain child kind of stuff. But that's honestly, that's the honest answer. But I
That's
am,
the best answer. That is the absolute best answer. And you do not
yeah,
have to like come up with the smarter one. That is the right one.
trans parenting in 2024, it's like, what a wild world. So
What a journey.
I know. So I want to shout out my near and dear Sergio that's on the call, and Elliot as well. But Sergio has just been such a, when the self-care question, I should have just shouted out people like Sergio. But yeah, much love to all my folks. Yeah. Thank you, James. Oh,
Did James disappear? I think it's
like
possible.
James was like, that's enough. We're good.
Oh
We're
no.
good.
Well, I will take over and just say once again, thank you so much for this really thoughtful talk. I am currently teaching an intro foundations of queer studies class at the CUNY Graduate Center, co-teaching it with past ED of CLAGS, Justin Brown. And I just can't recommend these queer of color, trans of color conversations enough to my grad students who are reading, the classics and the canon, but to hear the kind of work that you're doing at the forefront of these fields is really important and so inspiring to them and all of us. So thank you for spending the time with us today. Thanks to everyone in the audience who came and those who are watching our live stream on YouTube, and to our future audiences who are watching this later on our YouTube channel as it is archived. And we invite you to register and join us for our next event on March 21st, and to sign up for our newsletter so that you can stay on top of all of these programming events that we have coming up. And finally, if you can, please do donate to CLAGS by going to clags.org and clicking on the donate button. We can't do this without your support. So thank you so much, everyone. We've got our James back.
I made it back to say bye. I'll tell you the story another time. Thank you for your patience.
Bye, everybody.
Hey, everyone.
All right. Thank you, truly. What sweet chaos we like to have here. I'm gonna figure out the end point, I think is leaving. All right.
All good. Oh. Oh, okay.
All right. And
much.
it's still recording, but there it is. There it is. All right. Oh, and you are getting some comments. People are saying fantastic. Search is saying fantastic talk. Thank you. So
Great. Oh,
yeah.
that's
All right. Have a good evening.
much. All right. And you don't need anything else from me. Okay. Okay.
Not that I don't think so. I think we're done.
Thanks so much, Laura, for
All
setting this
right. Thank you. James, are you able to stop this?
I don't seem to have that option.
Yeah, neither do I. It must be special events.
This is a series of problems we have never had before.
I
So
know.
I'm gonna mute and we're gonna do a deep troubleshoot after this, and we're gonna figure this out. Maybe we need to go to the YouTube, but I will figure this out.
Okay.